Here's what nobody tells you about effort. It has a shadow. The harder your mind works to produce a state, calm, confidence, love, abundance, the more it has to check whether that state has arrived. And that checking is the problem, not a metaphor. A measured, replicated, deeply inconvenient psychological fact. I want to be honest about how I found this out, because it didn't come from a journal article first. It came from lying awake at 2 in the morning 3 years ago, trying to manifest sleep. I'd read that if you visualize an outcome vividly enough, your nervous system starts treating it as already true. So I visualized rest, my body heavy, my breath slow, my mind quiet. And the more I pictured it, the more awake I became, because some part of me was standing guard, checking every few seconds. Is it working yet? That checking was its own form of vigilance, and vigilance and sleep cannot occupy the same nervous system at once. I was rehearsing the exact opposite of what I wanted, using the very tool I thought would produce it. That night sent me looking for an explanation, and it turned out one already existed, one that nearly everyone has lived through without ever hearing its name. Ironic process theory. In the late 1980s, psychologist Daniel Wegner ran an experiment that's since become one of the most cited findings in the study of self-control. He asked people to do one simple thing for 5 minutes. Don't think about a white bear. Ring a bell every time the thought showed up anyway. Almost everyone rang that bell, often within the first 60 seconds. Not because they were bad at following instructions, but because the instruction itself required holding white bear in mind in order to check for its absence. To monitor for the absence of a thought, the brain has to keep a copy of that thought on standby. Suppression and monitoring run on the same circuitry, and the monitoring leaks. Now take that out of the lab and put it in your life. Every time you try to manifest something by focusing hard on wanting it, some part of you has to keep checking. Do I still want this enough? Do I believe it's coming? That checking is functionally identical to Wegner's bell. You're not actually holding the outcome in your mind. You're holding its absence over and over, dressed up as focus. The lack becomes the loudest signal in the room because you keep polling for it. This shows up everywhere once you know what you're looking for. The person who checks their bank app 4 times a day isn't checking to see if money arrived. They're checking to confirm the fear that it hasn't. The person who rereads an old message for the 40th time isn't looking for closure. They're keeping a live feed open to the wound and calling it processing. Manifestation practice, as it's usually taught, asks you to do exactly this to your own desires. Check in on them constantly, under the banner of focus, and call the checking devotion. What you were calling devotion was surveillance wearing a disguise. And surveillance was never effort, no matter how disciplined it felt. It shows up in a subtler form too, one that manifestation culture has actually built a whole vocabulary around: waiting for signs. You ask the universe for confirmation, and then you start scanning. A repeating number on a clock, a song lyric that feels too on the nose, a stranger's sentence that seems to answer your exact question. None of that is inherently irrational. Humans are pattern-detecting animals, and pattern detection isn't the problem. The problem is what the scanning does to your nervous system while it's running. Every glance at the clock, every straining to hear meaning in a stranger's small talk, is another bell ringing in Wegner's sense, another confirmation that the thing you want hasn't shown up yet, filed as evidence, moment by moment, under the heading of faith. So if the thing sabotaging you was never a lack of willpower, what was it exactly? Here's the part that should stop you. This isn't a flaw in your technique, it's a flaw in the premise. If wanting to feel abundant requires repeatedly checking whether you feel abundant yet, then trying is structurally rigged against itself. No matter how disciplined you are, how many vision boards you make, how precisely you word an affirmation. The architecture of trying harder contains a feedback loop that reinforces the very lack it's meant to erase. There's a second layer to Wegner's research that rarely makes it into the retelling, and it matters for everything that follows. He didn't just show that suppression backfires, he mapped when it backfires hardest. Under low stress, people could sometimes override the rebound effect through sheer attentional control. But under fatigue, pressure, or emotional intensity, exactly the state most people are in when they're desperately trying to manifest a way out of a hard situation, the ironic process wins almost every time. The very desperation that makes you want a technique to work is the condition under which that technique is guaranteed to fail. That isn't a design flaw built to punish you. It's a feature of attention itself, one that evolved to keep threats in view, not to help you relax your way into a new job or a new relationship. He also had a term for what happens once suppression finally stops: rebound. The thought doesn't fade quietly when you release your grip. It comes back louder, more frequent once the effort of holding it down is gone. Anyone who has tried to talk themselves out of wanting something, only to find the wanting return with more force a week later, has lived a rebound firsthand. That isn't weakness resurfacing. It's the mechanism completing the exact loop it was always going to complete. So ask yourself honestly, the last time you tried hardest to manifest something, were you calm or were you afraid? Because if you were afraid, the mechanism was never working for you. It was working against you quietly the whole time. If effort isn't the lever, what is? This is where most self-help content quietly stalls, because its only answer is to try differently, try more consistently, which is still trying. But there's a discipline that ran headfirst into this exact wall almost a century ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with psychology or manifestation, reasons that were purely physical. And what it found at the bottom of that wall is stranger and more precise than anything a manifestation coach has ever claimed, because nobody needed to embellish it. The data did the unsettling part on its own. Picture a narrow slit in a metal plate, so small it's measured in fractions of a hair's width. Now picture two of them, side by side, with a screen behind to catch whatever passes through. A technician switches on a source of electrons, invisible, indivisible, as solid a piece of matter as physics has ever agreed on, and lets them fly toward the slits, one at a time, with nothing tracking their path. What lands on the screen isn't two clean stripes, the way you'd expect from two open doors. It's a rippling pattern of bands, light and dark, spreading and repeating, the signature of a wave interfering with itself, as if each single electron had somehow gone through both slits at once and collided with its own other self on the far side. Then the technician changes one thing. They place a detector at the slits, a way to measure, however gently, which slit each electron actually passes through. Nothing else changes. Same electrons, same slits, same screen. And the pattern on the screen collapses. The ripples vanish. In their place, two clean stripes, exactly what you'd expect from two ordinary doors letting through two ordinary streams of particles. This is the double-slit experiment, first performed with light in the early 1800s by Thomas Young, and repeated with single particles, electrons and later entire molecules, through the 20th century as quantum mechanics matured. It remains, 200 years later, one of the strangest reliable results in physics. Whether something behaves like a wave of possibility or a solid located particle depends on whether it's being measured. Now, here is where almost everything you've heard about this experiment outside a physics classroom goes wrong, and it matters that you see exactly where the line sits. The popular version, the one manifestation content has run with for 2 decades, says that consciousness creates reality, that your attention, your belief, your focused intention is what collapses the wave function into the outcome you want. That's not what the experiment shows. What collapses the pattern isn't a human noticing, wanting, or believing something. It's physical measurement, an interaction between the particle and a detecting instrument that necessarily disturbs the system, regardless of whether any conscious being ever looks at the readout. You could run this experiment, record the detector data, and never once look at the results, and the interference pattern would still collapse. Consciousness isn't the mechanism. Interaction is. This is called the Copenhagen interpretation, developed largely by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the 1920s. One interpretation among several serious ones, not the final word, but the most widely taught. What it actually claims is precise and less mystical than the folklore. A quantum system exists in a superposition of possible states, described mathematically as a wave of probabilities, until it interacts with something that forces a definite outcome. That something is usually an instrument, not a mind. Later refinements, particularly the theory of decoherence developed from the 1970s onward, explain this even more concretely. Any interaction with a larger environment, a detector, a stray photon, the air in the room, is enough to destroy the delicate coherence that lets a particle behave like a spread-out wave, forcing it into one classical, located outcome. No belief required, no focus required, just contact. So if you've been told your thoughts alone are quantum mechanically shaping your reality, the way an electron responds to a detector, that claim doesn't survive contact with the actual physics. It's a beautiful metaphor. It is not a citation. And yet, this is the part that gets buried under the correction. Something genuinely strange survives even after you strip away the mystical overreach. Before measurement, the electron isn't lying about its position and hiding the truth from you. It doesn't have one. The mathematics doesn't describe our ignorance of a hidden definite fact. It describes a system that is, in some real sense, actually undetermined until it interacts with something else. Einstein spent decades resisting this. He believed there had to be hidden variables, a definite reality underneath the probabilities, and in 1935, with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, he published what's now called the EPR paradox, arguing the Copenhagen picture had to be incomplete. Later experimental tests of entangled particles, most decisively in the 1980s and refined for decades after, came down against Einstein. The universe, at its smallest layer, does not hold a hidden answer waiting to be discovered. It holds a range of possibility that only resolves into a specific outcome through contact. It helps to be concrete about why decoherence happens so fast in ordinary life and so rarely gets a chance to show its stranger side. A single electron in a vacuum, isolated from nearly everything, can maintain its wave-like superposition long enough to produce that rippling pattern. But the moment a system is large enough, warm enough, and surrounded by enough other particles bumping into it, which describes literally everything you can see with your eyes, including you, decoherence happens in a fraction of a second. That's the honest answer to why you never see a coffee cup do anything like what a single electron does. It isn't that the coffee cup obeys different laws. It's that the coffee cup is in constant, unavoidable contact with its environment, and that contact resolves any quantum weirdness almost instantly, long before it could ever become visible. Contact, again, doing the work. Not belief, not attention, not a mind reaching out and touching the cup with intention. Here's why that matters for you. And it has nothing to do with intentions bending photons. It has to do with a much less exotic parallel, psychological rather than physical, but structurally identical once you see it. An undetermined system, forced into resolution not by force or by wanting, but by the nature of contact itself. You cannot manifest an electron into a specific position by wanting it hard enough from across the room. But something in that system does change based on how it's approached, gently, through measurement, through relationship, rather than through will. Sit with this for a second, because it's the pivot point of the entire video. What if the mistake was never believing reality responds to observation? What if the mistake was believing observation means forcing, that to observe, in the sense that actually changes anything, has to look like effort, vigilance, intensity? In physics, observation isn't the mind straining toward an outcome. It's contact, presence, a relationship between a system and something outside it, undramatic, almost passive, compared to what manifestation culture has built around the word. That reframes everything you already learned from Wegner's research about trying. If contact, not force, is what resolves an undetermined system in physics, and vigilance, not calm attention, is what keeps a psychological state locked in place, then two problems from two disciplines that never spoke to each other might be pointing at the exact same underlying error. One studied particles, one studied minds. Neither found room for straining as the mechanism of change. It's worth knowing that this wasn't a settled point physicists agreed on overnight. At the Solvay conference in Brussels in 1927, Bohr and Einstein argued about exactly this in hallway conversations, over breakfast, in front of nearly every major physicist alive at the time, with Einstein constructing increasingly clever thought experiments designed to catch the theory contradicting itself, and Bohr each time finding the flaw in the trap. Einstein never stopped being uneasy about it. His famous line that God does not play dice with the universe was aimed directly at this idea, that some things are genuinely, irreducibly undetermined until measured, not just unknown to us. Bohr's reported reply was somewhere between a joke and a rebuke. Stop telling God what to do. The unease was never resolved by one side simply winning. It was resolved by later experiments confirming, again and again, that reality behaves the way Bohr's side described, however uncomfortable that remained. Later versions of this experiment made the picture even stranger and even more precise about what observation does and doesn't require. In what's known as the delayed choice quantum eraser, physicists arranged a setup where information about which slit a particle went through could be recorded and then later erased before anyone ever looked at it, and the interference pattern reappeared retroactively in the data once the which path information was gone. That result has been badly misused by pop science content to suggest the future changes the past. It doesn't. What it actually confirms more precisely than the original experiment could is that the pattern was never about anyone's belief or knowledge as a psychological state. It was about whether which path information existed anywhere in the physical universe, recoverable or not. Contact and information, not consciousness and desire, are still doing all the work. So if it isn't force and it isn't vigilance, what does observation without forcing actually look like, done by a human being, toward an ordinary desire in an ordinary life? That's the harder question. It doesn't have a physics answer. It has a psychological one. There's a psychologist who spent decades studying exactly this gap. Not the physics of it, the human cost of it. James Gross, working out of Stanford beginning in the 1990s, built what's now one of the most replicated models in emotion research, the process model of emotion regulation. At its center sits a distinction that maps almost perfectly onto everything you've just seen in a bubble chamber and a sleepless bedroom. Gross found that people regulate emotional states through two broadly different strategies. The first is suppression, actively pushing down a state you don't want, or straining to manufacture one you do. The second is reappraisal, changing your relationship to the situation itself, the meaning you're assigning it, so the state shifts as a downstream consequence rather than a direct target. Across decades of replication, suppression consistently produces worse outcomes, higher physiological stress markers, more intrusive thoughts, poorer memory for what actually happened, and critically, it doesn't even succeed at hiding the state, let alone changing it. People suppressing an emotion still leak it in their face, their voice, their posture, while paying a hidden cost to keep failing at the concealment. Reappraisal, by contrast, produces the state shift you were actually after, with none of the collateral damage, because it changes the input rather than fighting the output. Think about what that means for the version of manifestation most people were taught. Force yourself to feel abundant, push away doubt the moment it appears, override the fear with intensity of focus. That's suppression, dressed in spiritual language. And Gross's data says with remarkable consistency that suppression is close to the least effective regulation strategy available to a human nervous system. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because it's structurally the wrong tool. Here's where it gets concrete. Picture someone the night before a job interview that matters enormously to them. They know the advice. Visualize confidence. Force a powerful posture. Repeat affirmations until the anxious voice goes quiet. So they try. They stand in front of the mirror and tell themselves, I'm calm, I'm capable, this job is mine. And underneath every repetition, a quieter voice runs its own commentary. But what if it isn't? What if I freeze? What if they can tell? The affirmation isn't erasing that voice, it's suppressing it, which means, per Gross's findings, it's keeping the voice fully active and metabolically expensive just below the surface, while adding the labor of holding it down on top. Now picture the same person doing something structurally different, not fighting the fear, not affirming it away, reappraising what the interview actually means, not I must get this or I've failed, but this is one conversation with information flowing both ways, and I get to find out whether this is a place I actually want to be, not just whether they want me. Nothing about the outcome has changed. The job is exactly as uncertain as it was 30 seconds ago. But the nervous system's read of the situation has shifted from threat to be defended against to encounter to be met. And the anxious voice doesn't need to be pushed down anymore because it no longer has anything urgent to protest. This is what allowing actually looks like mechanically, stripped of the mysticism. It isn't passivity. It isn't giving up on the outcome. It's redirecting the labor from fighting the current state to reinterpreting the situation that's generating that state. A completely different job, using a completely different part of the mind, at a completely different cost. It was never suppression that made the difference. It was reappraisal, and that single distinction is the entire gap between forcing and allowing. Apply this to whatever you've been trying to manifest. If you've been telling yourself you're already abundant, while a quiet internal auditor keeps a running tally of the evidence against that claim, you're suppressing and the auditor is winning, exactly as Gross's data would predict. If you've been forcing belief in a relationship outcome, while every unanswered text runs a background check on your worth, that's suppression too, wearing a manifestation vocabulary. In both cases, the technique isn't failing because you're insufficiently disciplined. It's failing because discipline was never the missing ingredient. A change in relationship to the desire was. Here's the piece that tends to get lost, and it's worth being precise about it. Reappraisal is not the same as detachment, and it's not the same as pretending you don't want what you want. Gross was careful about this distinction, and so should you be. Reappraisal doesn't ask you to lower the stakes or convince yourself the outcome doesn't matter. Research on suppressed desire shows that route just produces a different flavor of the same rebound Wegner documented. What reappraisal asks is smaller and stranger. Hold the want, but loosen your grip on the specific mechanism by which it has to arrive, and on the specific timeline in which you're allowed to be at peace before it does. Gross's later work looked at whether reappraisal could actually be trained, rather than just observed, as a trait some people happen to have more of than others. And the answer, across multiple intervention studies, was yes. People taught to practice reinterpreting a stressful situation, deliberately and repeatedly, showed measurable improvement in emotional outcomes within weeks, not years. That detail matters enormously for anyone who assumes allowing is a fixed personality trait, something you either have or don't. It isn't. It's a skill with a learning curve, the same as any other, which means the checking habit you've had for a decade isn't a life sentence. It's just the strategy you happen to practice the most. That's a subtle enough shift that it's easy to miss why it changes anything. But it changes everything, because it removes the checking. If your peace is no longer contingent on confirmation that the outcome is coming, there's nothing left to monitor for. The bell from Wegner's white bear experiment stops ringing, not because you've gotten better at ignoring it, but because there's no longer a designated moment when it's supposed to ring. By now, the pattern should be visible across 3 unrelated fields: attention research, quantum physics, emotion regulation, converging on the same structural insight from 3 directions that never coordinated with each other. Vigilance sabotages. Force collapses the wrong pattern. Suppression costs more than it protects. In every case, the alternative isn't inaction. It's a different relationship to the desired outcome, one that doesn't require standing guard over it. Gross's lab put numbers behind this, not just theory. In one of the foundational studies, participants watched a disturbing film clip under different instructions. Some told to suppress any visible emotional reaction, some told to reappraise the footage as, say, a medical training video rather than a real tragedy, and some given no instruction at all. The suppression group showed elevated cardiovascular activity that outlasted the film itself, and their conversation partners afterward, who had no idea which condition anyone was in, rated interactions with the suppressors as more strained and less enjoyable. The cost of suppression leaked into a relationship the suppressor never intended to affect. The reappraisal group, by contrast, showed reduced emotional experience without the elevated physiological cost, and left no residue in the conversations that followed. Changing the meaning changed the entire downstream chain. Fighting the output changed nothing except how tired everyone involved became. This has a financial cousin worth naming, because manifestation content leans on money so heavily. Picture someone checking a stock or a business's daily numbers every hour, telling themselves they're staying on top of their abundance. Each check is framed as engagement, but functionally it's identical to the suppression condition in Gross's study. A nervous system bracing against bad news dressed as diligence. Compare that to someone who checks the same numbers once a week, at a set time, having already decided in advance what action each outcome would call for. Same information, same eventual awareness of what's happening, completely different relationship to the desired outcome, Because the second person reappraised the situation as something with a plan attached to it, rather than something requiring constant emotional standing guard. What that relationship actually feels like from the inside, and how you build it without allowing into just another performance to monitor for correctness, is where this gets personal. There's a place this question was already answered, almost 2,000 years before Wegner ran an experiment, or a physicist split a beam of light through two slits. Not answered gently, answered by a man who had every reason to need an answer. Epictetus was born into slavery in the 1st century, in a Roman province in what's now Turkey. He spent years as property before eventually gaining his freedom, went on to study and later teach philosophy, and built a framework that has outlasted nearly everything else from that era, not because it was comforting, but because it was accurate about something most people spend their whole lives refusing to accept. He called it the dichotomy of control, and it remains one of the most quietly devastating ideas ever formalized. Some things are up to us, and some things are not, and almost every form of suffering comes from treating the second category as if it belonged to the first. Up to us, our judgments, our efforts, our desires, our aversions, in short, everything that is our own doing. Not up to us, our body, our reputation, our possessions, and this is the part that guts the entire manifestation industry in a single sentence: outcomes. Not the effort toward the outcome itself. Epictetus offered an image for this that has survived better than almost anything else he said, precisely because it's so easy to picture. An archer. The archer trains for years, studies the wind, chooses the finest bow available and takes careful aim. Every part of that process is up to them, and it deserves their full effort. But the instant the arrow leaves the string, something can still happen that no archer controls. A sudden gust, a bird crossing the path, an imperfection in the shaft nobody could see. The outcome of the shot was never fully theirs to guarantee, only the quality of the aim. Epictetus's point wasn't that the archer shouldn't care whether the arrow lands. It was that caring and controlling are two different things, and confusing them is where the suffering comes from. Sit with how strange this is against everything you've been taught about manifesting. The premise of most manifestation content is that the outcome is, in fact, up to you. That with the right thought, the right frequency, the right consistency of belief, you can place a specific external result under your personal jurisdiction. Epictetus would have called that not ambition, but a category error and a source of guaranteed suffering, because you're assigning yourself authority over something that was never structurally available to you to control. The job offer. The person choosing you back. The timeline. None of it was ever yours to hold. Only the direction of your own effort was. This isn't fatalism, and it isn't an excuse to stop wanting things. Epictetus wasn't arguing for passivity. By every account, he was a rigorous, demanding teacher who expected total effort from his students. In the one place effort actually functions, their own judgments and actions. What he was doing was relocating the site of control to the only place it was ever real, so that the parts of life that were never negotiable stop being treated as a referendum on your worth. Here's what this means for you when you're the one sitting with a desire you can't seem to make land. The exhausting, checking, vigilant version of manifestation asks you to hold the outcome as though it were up to you, which means every day it doesn't arrive reads as a personal failure, a referendum on whether you did it right, believed hard enough, deserved it. Epictetus's framework asks something almost unrecognizable by comparison. Direct your full effort toward what's actually yours, your choices, your actions, the quality of your attention this hour, and let the outcome exist in the category it was always structurally in. Not abandoned, not ignored, just correctly filed. Epictetus taught much of this at a school he eventually founded in Nicopolis, in northwestern Greece, after being expelled from Rome, along with other philosophers by imperial decree. His students weren't wealthy dilettantes looking for comfort. Many came specifically because his teaching was known to be blunt to the point of discomfort. One of his most repeated instructions, later compiled by a student into the short manual known as the Enchiridion, was to rehearse the distinction constantly, on small things first, so it would be available when something large was on the line. When you kiss your child goodnight, remember you're kissing a mortal, not to court despair, but so that if loss ever comes, You meet it without the added injury of having pretended it was impossible. Applied to desire, the same rehearsal applies. Want the outcome fully and simultaneously hold the plain fact that it was never fully in your hands to guarantee. That combination, full wanting, zero entitlement to the result, is precisely what allowing means in practice. And it's a much harder discipline than forcing ever was, because it doesn't get to hide behind the appearance of control. There's a modern psychological model that maps this ancient distinction with uncomfortable precision, and it comes from a completely different tradition: family therapy. Richard Schwartz developed internal family systems, or IFS, starting in the 1980s, out of clinical work with patients whose inner lives clearly weren't unified. They described themselves in terms of competing parts, each with its own voice, its own fears, its own agenda. Schwartz's model proposes that beneath all of those parts sits something more stable, a core self, characterized by qualities he summarized as curiosity, calm, clarity, courage, compassion, confidence, creativity, and connectedness, qualities that don't need to be manufactured, because the model holds they're already present underneath the noise, the way sky is still there underneath weather. The part of you that has been trying to manifest by force, checking, straining, vigilant, exhausted, is not in this model the whole of you. It's a part, usually what Schwartz would call a manager part, one whose entire job is to prevent disappointment by controlling every variable it can reach, including variables that were never actually reachable. That part isn't broken, and it isn't the enemy. From its own point of view, it's working overtime to protect you from a hurt it's terrified will happen again. But it is, structurally, doing exactly what Wegner's participants were doing with the white bear, monitoring so hard for the absence of the thing you want, that the absence is all that ever gets amplified. Allowing in this framework isn't the manager part learning to try harder at relaxing. That would just be more managing. It's the self showing up instead, the part of you that was never in a state of lack to begin with, that doesn't need the outcome to arrive in order to already be whole, curious, and engaged with the present moment. You're not being asked to defeat the anxious, checking part. You're being asked to stop letting it run the whole operation and to let a steadier part of you take the lead. In practice, this looks less dramatic than it sounds. It's the difference between a person who opens their dating app and immediately starts calculating whether this week's matches mean anything about their worth. That's the manager part, running the show, treating every data point as a verdict. And a person who opens the same app, notices the anxious commentary starting up and, without fighting it, lets a calmer, more curious part answer instead. Let's see who's here today. Same action, same app, same underlying want. Completely different part in charge, and completely different residue left behind afterward. Here's where physics, Wegner, Gross, Epictetus, and Schwartz all converge on the same floor, from 5 directions that never once sighted each other. An undetermined system resolves through contact, not force. A suppressed thought rebounds harder the longer it's held down. A regulated emotion changes through reappraisal, not override. An outcome outside your control produces suffering only when you misfile it as belonging to you. A frightened, vigilant part of you can only be soothed by a calmer part taking the lead, never by that same frightened part trying harder at being calm. None of these 5 findings needed the others to be true. They arrived at the same architecture independently across 2,000 years and 4 separate disciplines, because the architecture was never a belief system. It's a structural fact about how attention, systems, and control actually behave, one that any honest inquiry, physical or psychological or philosophical, eventually runs into and has to reckon with. Allowing isn't the absence of effort. It's effort correctly located, poured entirely into what was always yours and quietly withdrawn from what never was. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because I think I know who's still watching at this point in the video, and it isn't everyone. It's the person who checks. You know if this is you. You check your phone the second it buzzes, hoping and dreading in the same half second. You reread the last message in a conversation for the 4th time tonight, looking for a tone that might have changed since the 3rd reading. You've made a vision board, or written the affirmation on a sticky note on your mirror, and some part of you checks in with it every morning like taking your own pulse. Not to celebrate progress, but to see if the lack is still there. It usually still is, because checking is exactly what keeps it visible. You are not undisciplined. That's the thing I most want you to hear. You have been unbelievably disciplined. Disciplined enough to run a vigilance protocol for months, sometimes years, on a desire that keeps refusing to arrive on schedule. That takes stamina most people don't have. The problem was never your commitment. It was that your commitment got pointed at the wrong target, at guarding the outcome instead of tending the one thing that was ever actually yours to tend. Maybe it's a relationship you can't stop auditing for signs it's slipping. Maybe it's a career outcome you've turned into a referendum on whether you're fundamentally enough. Maybe it's something smaller and more private than either of those, a version of yourself you keep trying to force into existence through sheer will, checking every night whether you've become her yet. Here's what I'm not going to tell you, that you should just relax and it'll happen. That's the same lazy advice dressed in softer clothing, and it still asks the checking part of you to somehow try harder at not checking, which you now know, structurally, cannot work. What I am telling you is narrower, and I think more useful. The vigilance was never protecting the outcome. It was protecting you from being blindsided by its absence, a kind of pre-grief, so that if the loss came, it wouldn't come as a surprise. That's not a character flaw. That's an old strategy, probably built long before this particular desire ever existed, doing the only job it knows how to do. It just isn't the job that was needed here, and you get to notice that without fighting the part of you that's still standing guard. You can thank it for trying to keep you safe and gently let something steadier take the next shift. Maybe you're the one who started checking the clock for repeating numbers, or pulling a card each morning, hoping the deck will confirm the thing you're already desperate to hear. There's nothing wrong with any of those practices in themselves. What's worth noticing is the tone you bring to them, whether you're approaching with curiosity or whether you're interrogating them for a verdict, the way you'd reread a text message looking for proof. The practice isn't the problem. The posture underneath it is, and if none of that is you, if what you've been guarding is quieter than any of these examples, something you've never said out loud to anyone, the mechanism is still the same. Vigilance always looks different on the outside, depending on what it's protecting. It always feels identical on the inside. You don't need to identify the exact desire out loud for any of this to apply. What you need is honest enough for a moment. Is the thing you're picturing right now something you're holding, or something that's been holding you, running your mornings, narrating your evenings, showing up uninvited in conversations that have nothing to do with it? If the answer is the second one, you already know better than I could tell you exactly what's been standing guard. So let's go back to where this started. To you, eyes closed, jaw tight, trying so hard to manifest something that it kept moving further away, like sand gripped too tightly. You asked, at the start of this video, what actually changes when you stop trying? Here's the answer. Assembled from 5 directions that never spoke to each other and arriving improbably at the exact same place. What changes is not your desire. Your desire stays exactly as strong, exactly as legitimate, exactly as worth having. What changes is the location of your effort. It stops being spent on monitoring the outcome, checking, auditing, standing guard against an absence you keep accidentally amplifying by watching for it, and starts being spent on the only 2 things that were ever structurally yours: your own actions and your relationship to the situation generating your desire in the first place. An electron doesn't resolve into a definite state because someone wanted it to hard enough from across the room. It resolves through contact, through a relationship with something outside it, undramatic, almost gentle compared to the mythology built around the word observation. A suppressed thought doesn't disappear because you fought it harder. It rebounds, louder, the moment your guard finally drops, exactly as Wegner's white bear rebounded on everyone who tried to banish it by force. A regulated emotion doesn't shift because you overrode it. It shifts because you changed your relationship to what it meant, the way Gross's research shows reappraisal succeeding precisely where suppression fails. An outcome outside your control doesn't arrive faster because you claimed jurisdiction over it. It was never yours to claim, and the exhaustion of trying to hold it was optional the entire time, exactly as Epictetus argued from a position with far less freedom than you currently have. And the frightened part of you standing guard over all of it was never going to be soothed by trying harder to be calm. It needed something steadier to take the lead instead, not defeat it, just outrank it, the way Schwartz's model describes self showing up for a frightened part rather than fighting it. Trying was never the missing ingredient. It was the mechanism quietly working against you the entire time, confirmed independently by 5 different disciplines, none of which needed the other's permission to arrive at the same conclusion. Not forcing, allowing, and now you know, structurally, precisely what that word means instead of just hoping it means something. Here's the turn I didn't tell you was coming. This was never really a video about manifestation. It's a video about where you've been spending a resource you don't have an infinite supply of, attention, and what happens when you finally stop spending it, guarding a door that was never going to open faster for being watched. The job, the relationship, the version of yourself you're reaching for, none of it needed your vigilance to arrive. It needed your hands free enough to actually build something while you were busy checking whether it had shown up yet. You already know what you've been guarding. You've known since the first minute of this video. The only real question left is what you do with your hands, now that they don't have to hold the door shut anymore. None of this promises the outcome arrives on your preferred schedule or in the shape you originally pictured it. That was never a promise on offer, from Epictetus, from Schwartz, from a physicist watching electrons land on a screen. What's on offer instead is smaller, and in the end more livable. The version of you that isn't spending every hour standing guard over a door, free to actually build the life the checking was always meant to protect, instead of just protecting it from ever being lived in. If this way of thinking feels more honest than anything the manifestation industry has sold you, subscribing here isn't just following a channel. It's a small, repeatable act of telling yourself you're someone who chooses clarity over comfortable illusions, someone who would rather understand the mechanism than keep repeating a technique that was never built to work. Comment: I choose allowing.